I am Justine, 34 years old, and for 12 years, my family thought I was a broke hospitality worker they had successfully discarded. They had absolutely no idea I was the shadow CEO of a billion-dollar resort empire. When they invited me to their lavish vow renewal just to humiliate me, they did not realize they had booked the venue at my own property using money they did not have. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Now let me take you back to the day that ended my family and started my empire. The air in my dorm room was thick with the suffocating heat of an Atlanta May. I was 22 years old and standing in front of a cheap full-length mirror adjusting the collar of my graduation gown. I had just graduated magna cum laude from Spelman College. It was an achievement I had bled for. I worked 3 jobs, taking night shifts at a hotel front desk and weekend shifts at a diner just to keep my tuition paid. My parents, Calvin and Sylvia, had not contributed a single dime to my education. They claimed all their liquid assets were tied up in supporting my older sister Monique. Monique was 36 now, but back then she was the undisputed golden child of our family. She was frivolous, demanding, and constantly in need of financial rescuing. Despite all of that, my parents had promised me one thing for my graduation. They promised they would take me out for a celebratory dinner at the most expensive steakhouse in Buckhead. It was a small concession, a tiny crumb of parental affection, but I had clung to it for 4 years. I checked my watch. It was 6 in the evening. Our reservation was for 7. I smoothed down my white dress and picked up my phone expecting a text saying they were stuck in traffic. Instead, the phone rang. It was my mother. I answered with a smile on my face. "Mom, I am all ready. Are you and Dad close by?" Sylvia's voice came through the speaker, sharp and rushed. "Justine, listen to me. We are canceling your dinner. We cannot make it." I froze. The smile melted off my face as a cold, familiar knot formed in my stomach. "What do you mean you are canceling? The restaurant charges a cancellation fee this late, Mom. And it is my graduation day." "Do not use that tone with me," Sylvia snapped. "We have a family emergency. Spencer just proposed to Monique, and she is having a full-blown panic attack over the ring size. It is a princess cut, but she wanted a cushion cut. She cannot stop crying, and we need to be here to calm her down and celebrate with them." Spencer made reservations at a country club for the 4 of us. I stood there staring at my reflection. My sister was having a tantrum over the shape of a diamond from her white boyfriend, a man who called himself a tech entrepreneur, but had never held down a real job. And my parents were abandoning my college graduation to wipe her tears. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "I am graduating today. I worked for 4 years for this. You promised me this one dinner." Sylvia scoffed loudly into the receiver. "Oh, please, Justine, do not be so dramatic. You already walked across the stage. The dinner is just food. Monique is taking a massive step in her life, and she needs her mother and father right now. You have always been the independent one. You know how to take care of yourself. Just order some takeout. We will send you a gift card next week." Before I could even process the absolute callousness of her words, the line went dead. She hung up on me. A moment later, my phone buzzed with a text message from my father, Calvin. It read, "Do not give your mother a hard time today. Monique needs us. You are the strong one. Figure it out. You are the strong one." That was the phrase they always used to weaponize my resilience. Because I was strong, I did not deserve support. Because I was capable, I did not deserve celebration. I was the scapegoat, the workhorse, the invisible daughter. Monique was the delicate flower who needed their constant financial and emotional devotion. I did not cry. I think I was simply out of tears. The reservoir of hope I had kept for my parents finally dried up completely in that sweltering dorm room. I took off my graduation gown, folded it neatly, and packed it into my suitcase. I gathered the last of my belongings. I took out a small yellow sticky note and wrote a simple message. "Congratulations to the family of 3. Have a wonderful life." I stuck the note to the mirror, grabbed my bags, and walked out the door. I changed my phone number the very next morning. I blocked their social media accounts. I severed every single tie that connected me to Calvin, Sylvia, and Monique. I walked away and I never looked back. 12 years passed. 12 years of unrelenting grind, sleepless nights, and calculated risks. I did not just survive my family's abandonment. I weaponized the pain. I took my degree and my experience at the hotel front desk and turned it into an obsession with the hospitality industry. I started as a junior manager at a boutique hotel in Chicago. Within 3 years, I was the general manager. By 28, I had secured venture capital funding to launch my own property management firm. Today, at 34, I am the founder and chief executive officer of Oasis Crown Holdings. We own and operate 16 ultra-luxury resorts across North America and the Caribbean. I built an empire with my own 2 hands, answering to no one but myself and my brilliant fiancé, Elias. Elias was a powerhouse in his own right, a razor-sharp financial strategist who understood my ambition because it mirrored his own. Together, we were untouchable. My office was a sprawling glass penthouse in downtown Atlanta, offering a panoramic view of the city I had once struggled to survive in. It was a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my custom mahogany desk reviewing our quarterly acquisition reports when my executive assistant Marcus walked in. He carried a silver tray with my morning espresso and a thick, ostentatious envelope. "This arrived by courier, Madam CEO," Marcus said, placing the envelope on my desk. It was marked highly confidential and personal. I picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy textured and sealed with cheap gold wax. I sliced it open with my letter opener and pulled out a massive, over-designed invitation card covered in fake gold foil and swirling calligraphy. It read, "You are cordially invited to witness the 10-year vow renewal of Spencer and Monique Sterling. An evening of elite luxury, timeless love, and empire building." I stared at the names, Monique and Spencer, my sister and the man whose proposal had eclipsed my graduation. They were renewing their vows. My parents must have hired a private investigator to track down a mailing address for me because I had kept my residential and corporate information completely disconnected from my maiden name. But the names were not what made me sit up straight. It was the location printed at the bottom of the card. The event will be hosted at the Azure Resort and Spa, Palm Beach, Florida. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I leaned back in my leather chair and began to laugh. It was a rich, deep laugh that echoed in the quiet office. Marcus looked at me with mild concern but said nothing. The Azure Resort. It was a massive, sprawling billionaire playground in South Florida, known for its private beaches, 5-star dining, and astronomical price tags. It was also the exact property that Oasis Crown Holdings had acquired just 2 weeks ago in a private $80 million cash buyout. My estranged family, desperate to project an image of extreme wealth, had booked their ridiculous vow renewal at a property that I personally owned. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the speed dial for Elias. He answered on the first ring. "Good morning, beautiful Elias," said his deep voice, instantly calming. "Tell me we are closing the Miami deal today." "We are," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the gaudy invitation. "But I have something much more entertaining to share. My sister is renewing her vows next month." Elias paused. "The sister who ruined your college graduation, the one whose husband is currently under investigation for wire fraud." "That is the one," I said, "and you will never guess where they are hosting this little circus. They booked the Azure Resort." I heard Elias chuckle through the speaker. "You cannot make this up. The universe really does have a sense of humor. What is the play, Justine? Do we cancel their reservation? Do we lock them out?" "Absolutely not," I said, tracing the gold lettering on the card. "We let them have their party. They want to show off their wealth and status. I want them to feel like royalty, right up until the moment the bill comes due. But I am going to attend. You are going to Florida." Elias asked, his tone shifting to protective. "Justine, they are toxic. They do not deserve your presence." "I am not going as the CEO of Oasis Crown." I explained, my mind already formulating the strategy. "I am going as Justine, the hospitality worker. They have spent 12 years assuming I am a broke failure. I am going to let them believe it. I want to see exactly how they treat me when they think I am beneath them. I want to see the lengths they will go to maintain their fake empire, and then I am going to tear it down." Elias laughed a dark, understanding sound. "I will book my flight. I would not miss this for the world, but I will stay in the shadows until you need me. Give them enough rope to hang themselves." "Exactly," I said. I hung up the phone and looked at Marcus, who was standing by patiently waiting for instructions. "Marcus," I said, sliding the invitation across the desk. "RSVP to this event for one. Send it under my maiden name. Then get the general manager of the Azure Resort on a secure line for me. I need to give him some very specific, highly confidential instructions regarding a certain family arriving next month. Absolutely no one on the resort staff is to address me by my title when I arrive. As far as they are concerned, I am just a regular guest." "Right away, Madam CEO," Marcus said, taking the invitation and stepping out of the office. I turned my chair to look out over the Atlanta skyline. The sun was reflecting brilliantly off the glass buildings. 12 years ago, I had left this city with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. My mother had told me I was the strong one. My father had told me to figure it out. I did figure it out. I built a fortress of success that they could not even begin to comprehend. They wanted to play a game of status and wealth. They wanted to use this vow renewal to prove their superiority. But they had just walked blindly into my house. They were about to learn that the daughter they threw away was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their reckoning. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing for the trip with meticulous precision. I went shopping not for the designer labels I usually wore, but for clothes that would perfectly fit the narrative my family had constructed for me. I bought a plain off-the-rack dress from a mid-tier department store. I packed sensible worn-in shoes and a generic handbag. Every detail of my appearance was curated to scream mediocrity. I wanted Sylvia and Calvin to look at me and feel that immediate rush of superiority they craved so deeply. I wanted Monique to glance at my outfit and feel the smug satisfaction of knowing she was the successful sister. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, my executive team was gathering intelligence. Elias had pulled the preliminary financial profiles on Spencer's tech company. The data was laughable. Spencer had raised millions from private investors by promising revolutionary software, but the company had no actual product. It was a classic shell game, moving money from new investors to pay off old debts. Spencer was drowning in leverage, and the federal authorities were already circling. Furthermore, we pulled the reservation details for the vow renewal event at the Azure. The numbers did not make sense. The deposit for the grand ballroom, the catering, and the luxury suites was $50,000. The remaining balance to be paid upon checkout was a staggering $250,000. For a man whose credit cards were currently declining across multiple states, Spencer was throwing a party he absolutely could not afford. I knew there was a missing piece to this financial puzzle, and I intended to find it once I was on the ground in Florida. The morning of my flight, I stood in front of the mirror in my penthouse, much like I had done 12 years ago in that cramped dorm room. But the reflection looking back at me now was entirely different. I was no longer the desperate seeking girl waiting for a scrap of validation. I was a woman stepping onto a battlefield armed with absolute power. I picked up my generic suitcase, locked the door to my penthouse, and headed to the airport. I chose to fly commercial, sitting in economy class, just in case any extended family members were on the same flight. I was fully committed to the role. The Azure Resort awaited me, its white sand beaches and crystal clear waters glittering under the Florida sun. My staff was ready. My trap was perfectly laid. My family was about to experience the most expensive, devastating weekend of their entire lives, and I was going to savor every single second of it. Let the games begin. The grand mahogany doors of the Azure Resort swung open as I stepped out of the complimentary airport shuttle. I had explicitly instructed my transportation team not to send the usual armored Maybach that typically accompanied my site visits. The humid Florida breeze washed over me, carrying the scent of sea salt and the expensive white orchids that I had personally selected for the property landscaping during the acquisition phase. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern luxury, with sweeping cathedral ceilings dripping with tiered crystal chandeliers and a panoramic wall of reinforced glass offering an unobstructed view of the private white sand beach. It was breathtaking and meticulously designed to cater to the ultra-wealthy, and it was all entirely mine. Every marble tile, every silk drape, every grain of sand on that private beach belonged to my holding company. Before I could even take a full breath to admire the architectural renovations I had approved just last month, a sharp, familiar voice pierced the tranquil atmosphere of the lobby. Justine, I cannot believe you actually showed up wearing that. I turned to see my mother Sylvia marching toward me across the polished marble floor. She was flanked by my father Calvin, who looked as perpetually exasperated and emotionally distant as I remembered from 12 years ago. Sylvia was draped in a loud floral resort wear dress that screamed new money, trying far too hard to fit in with the coastal elite. She stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, looking me up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust. I was wearing a simple beige linen shift dress and flat leather sandals. To the untrained eye of someone who only shopped at mid-tier department stores, it looked like a bargain bin find. To anyone who actually understood quiet wealth, it was a custom-tailored piece from a highly exclusive private atelier in Milan, worth more than my parents' entire luggage collection combined. But Sylvia only respected heavy logos she could read from across the room. "Hello, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and pleasant. "It is nice to see you too. Dad, you are looking well." Calvin gave a stiff, dismissive nod. "You are late," he grumbled, refusing to make direct eye contact. "Monique has been an absolute nervous wreck all morning trying to coordinate the welcome gift bags for the guests. We thought you would at least have the common decency to arrive early and help the staff set up the tables. You are supposed to be good at that sort of manual labor." "I am a guest, Dad," I replied mildly, keeping my posture relaxed. "Not the event coordinator." Sylvia scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes toward the crystal chandeliers. "Barely a guest," she muttered, crossing her arms over her chest. "Which brings me to why we were waiting for you down here in the lobby. We have a bit of a situation with the room assignments, and we need to handle it before it causes Spencer any undue stress." I tilted my head, feigning mild confusion. "A situation?" "Yes," Sylvia said, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "Spencer's parents. Richard and Margaret flew in this morning from Boston. They are accustomed to a very specific standard of living, Justine. They were initially placed in a standard ocean view room, but Margaret has terrible claustrophobia and simply cannot abide standard accommodations. They simply must have a luxury suite for the duration of the weekend." "And what exactly does that have to do with my reservation?" I asked, though I already knew exactly where this pathetic display of parental favoritism was going. Calvin cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable, but pushing forward with his usual demanding tone anyway. "The resort is completely booked for the weekend, due to some corporate event overlapping with the vow renewal. The only suite left in the wedding block was the premium one originally assigned to you. So we went ahead and took the liberty of having the front desk switch your reservations. Richard and Margaret are taking your suite. You will just have to make do with whatever else they have available." I looked past my parents to the massive front desk area. Standing there behind the imported Italian marble counter was Mr. Harrison, the general manager of the Azure Resort. He was a meticulous, highly trained professional whom I had personally hired away from a rival luxury global chain just 3 years ago. He caught my eye, and I could see the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from his pale face. The poor man looked like he was about to faint right there in the lobby. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew my ignorant parents were currently trying to downgrade the billionaire owner of the resort to accommodate some entitled, incredibly racist guests. Sylvia grabbed my upper arm and pulled me roughly toward the front desk. "Come along," she ordered, her grip surprisingly tight. "Let us just get your new key so you can get out of sight before Spencer's parents come downstairs for lunch. I do not want them asking uncomfortable questions about your completely inappropriate outfit." We reached the marble counter. Mr. Harrison was gripping the edges of the desk so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "Madam," he started, his voice trembling slightly as he looked directly at me, desperately seeking guidance. "I mean, Miss Justine, regarding the current room situation, I must insist that we find a much more suitable arrangement for you. We cannot possibly allow you to stay in." I cut him off with a very sharp, very subtle look. I gave him a tiny, barely imperceptible shake of my head. Do not blow my cover under any circumstances. It is perfectly fine, I said smoothly, turning to Mr. Harrison with a warm, reassuring smile. I completely understand there has been a mix-up with the wedding block assignments. Where have you reassigned my stay for the weekend? Mr. Harrison swallowed hard beads of nervous sweat forming on his forehead. He looked at Sylvia with barely concealed professional disdain, then quickly darted his eyes back to me. The only remaining accommodation is a temporary staff overflow room located on the second floor. It is directly adjacent to the service elevators and the commercial laundry chute. It is practically a utility closet. I strongly advise against it, Miss Justine. We can easily— Sylvia slammed her hand flat on the counter, interrupting him. She will take it, she practically shouted, drawing the attention of a nearby bellhop. Do not be ridiculous and do not try to upsell us. Justine does not need anything fancy or spacious. She is used to roughing it anyway. She works in hospitality, for heaven's sake. She probably sleeps in rooms worse than this all the time. A bed is a bed. Mr. Harrison looked like he wanted to leap over the marble counter and physically remove my mother from the premises using resort security. He opened his mouth to object once again, but I spoke first, seamlessly taking control of the narrative. I will take it, I said, keeping my voice light and incredibly accommodating. Just hand me the keycard, Mr. Harrison. It is truly not a problem at all. I am just happy to be here to celebrate my sister. With a visibly shaking hand, Mr. Harrison programmed a standard guest keycard and slid it across the marble counter. I could see the profound apology burning in his eyes. I slipped the plastic card into my woven handbag without breaking eye contact. Sylvia clapped her hands together, looking immensely satisfied with her ability to put me back in my designated place. Perfect. Now take your bags and use the service elevator so you do not crowd the main lobby or run into anyone important. The welcome mixer starts at 7 on the Sunset Terrace. Do try to find something a little more festive and appropriate to wear, Justine. We do not want Spencer's wealthy family thinking we invited the local cleaning staff to the party. Without another word, she linked arms with my father and strutted away toward the champagne lounge, leaving me standing completely alone at the front desk. Mr. Harrison immediately leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to an urgent, frantic whisper. Madam CEO, I am so incredibly sorry for this unacceptable situation. I can have them thrown out right now. Say the word, and their entire party is blacklisted from this property and every other Oasis Crown resort on the globe. We can void their contract immediately. I smiled genuinely, this time resting my hand gently on the marble counter. Relax, Harrison. You did exactly as you were supposed to do. Let them have their stolen suite. Let them firmly believe they run this place. Ensure all their room charges are fully active, and do not comp a single peanut or bottle of water they consume from the minibar. I want every single expense meticulously tracked. As you wish, Madam CEO, he said, standing up straighter and adjusting his suit jacket. I took the handle of my generic suitcase and deliberately walked away from the glamorous glass elevators, heading straight toward the hidden service corridors. The room was exactly as Mr. Harrison had described. It was a glorified storage closet typically utilized for overnight emergency staff during severe hurricanes. The thin walls vibrated slightly from the massive industrial washing machines operating one floor below, and the cramped space was barely large enough to fit a stiff, twin-sized bed and a modest wooden dresser. There was no balcony, no artwork, and no view. There was only a small, frosted window near the ceiling that let in a dull, gray, uninspiring light. I sat down on the edge of the remarkably stiff mattress and let out a soft, genuine laugh. Sylvia honestly thought she was punishing me. She firmly believed she was putting me in my proper place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. She had absolutely no idea that I had slept on floors much harder and much colder than this while ruthlessly building my empire. This tiny vibrating room was nothing but a temporary staging ground for the absolute destruction of their fake reality. It was the perfect vantage point from which to watch their house of cards collapse. I opened my suitcase and pulled out my chosen outfit for the evening welcome mixer. I had selected it with extreme care and calculated precision. It was a simple black slip dress with absolutely no visible designer branding, but cut from a silk so exquisitely heavy it draped over my frame like liquid water. I paired it with minimal jewelry, leaving behind my signature diamond tennis bracelets and opting for a simple, delicate gold chain. I wanted to look elegant but entirely unassuming. I wanted to be the perfect blank canvas for their aggressive projection of superiority. At exactly 6:45, I stepped out of the service elevator and made my way toward the Sunset Terrace. The sprawling resort grounds were beautifully illuminated by flaming tiki torches and the soft romantic glow of warm fairy lights woven expertly through the towering palm trees. I could hear the sounds of clinking crystal glasses and loud boastful laughter floating on the humid evening breeze long before I reached the party. The Sunset Terrace had been completely transformed for the extravagant welcome mixer. White linen cabanas dotted the perimeter, offering private seating areas, and a live jazz trio played smooth melodies in the far corner. Uniformed waiters circulated seamlessly through the crowd carrying heavy silver trays of imported vintage champagne and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. It was an incredibly expensive and lavish setup, and knowing what Elias and I knew about Spencer's rapidly declining credit limits, I wondered exactly whose stolen money was currently paying for the top-shelf open bar. I grabbed a tall glass of sparkling water with a lime twist from a passing waiter and positioned myself quietly near the edge of the crowd, observing the toxic dynamics at play. My sister Monique was holding court near the absolute center of the terrace. She was wearing a blindingly bright, heavily sequined gown that caught the torchlight with every dramatic movement. She was tossing her head back and laughing loudly at something Spencer's mother Margaret was saying, doing everything in her power to appease her white mother-in-law. Calvin and Sylvia hovered nervously at the outer edges of Monique's circle, looking exactly like anxious courtiers desperate for the king's ultimate approval. They nodded along enthusiastically to every single word spoken by Spencer's wealthy white parents, laughing a little too hard and smiling a little too wide. It was deeply pathetic to watch my parents completely abandon their dignity and cultural pride just to remain in the perceived proximity of generational wealth. And then there was Spencer. He was standing prominently near the expansive outdoor bar, surrounded by a group of his equally entitled groomsmen and a few unfortunate wedding guests who had been hopelessly cornered into listening to him. Spencer was nursing a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch, his face already flushed with alcohol and bloated self-importance. He was speaking loudly, his arrogant voice carrying easily over the gentle jazz music and the crashing waves. "It is just a matter of basic economics, guys," Spencer was saying, gesturing grandly with his scotch glass, spilling a few drops onto the stone patio. "You look at the current market trends, and it is obvious why certain demographics just cannot scale their businesses properly. They completely lack the aggressive, cutthroat mindset required to win." I moved a little closer, stepping quietly into the protective shadows of a nearby cabana to listen more closely. One of his groomsmen, a guy with slicked back hair and a permanent condescending smirk, nodded along in vigorous agreement. "You mean they do not have the stomach for real risk in the market?" "Exactly," Spencer said, taking a large, greedy gulp of his liquor. "I deal with it all the time in the tech sector. You see these black-owned startup funds or whatever cute name they call themselves trying to pitch these small-minded community-based ideas. They want to open local restaurants or little boutique marketing agencies. It is small potatoes. They completely lack Silicon Valley vision. They do not know how to build a scalable empire. They just want to play shop while the rest of us do the real work." I felt a tiny muscle feather in my jaw. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of a man who was currently under active federal investigation for massive wire fraud, a man whose so-called billion-dollar company was a literal shell game built on lies, lecturing anyone on how to build a legitimate empire, was mind-boggling. He was standing on a luxury property entirely owned by a black woman drinking expensive liquor provided by a black woman's global company and confidently declaring to his audience that black people inherently lacked business vision. Sylvia and Calvin were standing close enough to the bar to hear every single racist, condescending word spilling out of his mouth. They did not say a single thing. They did not defend their community. They did not defend their own decades of exhausting hard work. Calvin just stared at his expensive leather shoes, while Sylvia took a rapid, nervous sip of her champagne, clearly terrified of causing a scene that might possibly upset her perfect white son-in-law. Spencer laughed loudly, clapping his sycophant groomsman hard on the shoulder. "You have to understand macro-level market disruption. You have to be willing to play hard with the big boys. That is exactly why my platform is about to close a $50 million Series C funding round next week. Serious investors know I have the right pedigree to handle real wealth. He turned his head, slowly scanning the terrace crowd for more people to serve as an adoring audience for his lies. That was the exact moment his glassy eyes locked onto me, standing quietly by the draped cabana. His thin lips curled into a predatory, incredibly condescending grin. He had found his favorite target. He stepped away from his group of sycophant friends and raised his scotch glass high in my direction, his voice booming across the terrace, so that every single person stopped their conversations and turned to look. "Well, well, well," Spencer called out, his voice dripping with heavy sarcasm and fake enthusiasm. "Look who finally decided to join the adults. Justine. I was just talking about the hospitality industry. Come on over here. Tell my successful friends all about the daily hustle of folding fresh towels for a living. Let us hear your incredible vision for the future." The jazz music seemed to quiet down to a whisper. Monique stopped her loud fake laughing. Sylvia shot me a frantic, terrifying warning glare across the patio, silently demanding that I take the public humiliation without fighting back. Spencer stared at me confidently, waiting to make me his ultimate punchline for the evening. I walked out of my cramped room, the heavy thrum of the commercial washing machines humming beneath my feet, and made my way toward the Azure VIP Wellness Center. The spa was located in a secluded wing of the resort, surrounded by lush botanical gardens and cascading water features. As the owner of the property, I knew every square inch of this facility. I had personally approved the imported Himalayan salt room and the hydrotherapy circuits just 6 months ago. When I arrived at the pristine glass entrance, Monique and her 3 bridesmaids were already lounging in the private reception area. They were sipping cucumber-infused water and excitedly flipping through the extensive menu of premium treatments. The spa concierge, a polished young woman named Elena, was standing behind the desk with a strained, highly professional smile. "Ah, there she is," Monique announced, clapping her hands together as I walked in. "The whole gang is finally here. Elena, we are ready to begin our ultimate pampering experience." Elena nodded, her eyes darting briefly to me. I gave her a microscopic, reassuring nod, signaling her to proceed normally. "Wonderful, Mrs. Sterling," Elena said smoothly. "I have reserved the Grand Orchid Suite for your party. We have the caviar and 24-karat gold facials prepared, along with the deep tissue hot stone massages and the diamond dust body scrubs. Shall I have the attendants bring in the vintage champagne?" "Yes, absolutely," Monique declared, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Bring us 3 bottles of the Dom Perignon. We are celebrating today." One of the bridesmaids, a woman named Chelsea, leaned over and whispered loudly to Monique, "Are you sure about the Dom Mo? It's like $500 a bottle here." Monique let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. "Chelsea, please. Spencer's company is closing a $50 million deal next week. A few bottles of champagne are basically pocket change for us. Right, Justine?" She looked at me, her eyes glittering with malicious intent. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my supposed poverty. She wanted me to sit in that luxurious room surrounded by thousands of dollars of treatments and feel utterly insignificant compared to her massive fabricated wealth. "It certainly sounds extravagant," I said mildly, maintaining my neutral expression. "I'm sure you deserve it, Monique." We were ushered into the Grand Orchid Suite, a sprawling private sanctuary, featuring individual massage tables, a private plunge pool, and a balcony overlooking the ocean. For the next 4 hours, Monique and her friends indulged in every premium service the menu had to offer. They drank bottle after bottle of expensive champagne, laughed loudly, and gossiped about the other guests attending the vow renewal. I participated politely, accepting a basic deep tissue massage and a glass of sparkling water, declining the gold facials and the vintage champagne. I spent the time mentally calculating the mounting bill. Between the 4 gold facials, the diamond dust scrubs, the extended massages, and the imported alcohol, the total was climbing rapidly past the $10,000 mark. As the treatments finally concluded, we gathered back in the private lounge area, wrapped in thick, fluffy white robes. Monique looked radiant, her skin glowing from the expensive products, but there was a sharp, anxious tension in her shoulders that she was struggling to hide. I had noticed her checking her phone obsessively over the last hour, her brow furrowing with every new text message she received. Spencer was likely updating her on his rapidly deteriorating credit limits. Elena entered the lounge carrying a sleek leather folio. She approached Monique with a polite, deferential smile. "I hope you all enjoyed your services today, Mrs. Sterling," Elena said softly. "Whenever you are ready, I have the final folio for your review." Monique took the leather folder, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. She opened it and glanced down at the itemized receipt. I watched the muscles in her neck tighten. The total was staggering. Monique snapped the folder shut and let out a dramatic theatrical sigh. She looked around at her bridesmaids who were busy admiring their freshly manicured nails, and then she turned her gaze directly onto me. The trap was finally springing shut. "You know, Justine," Monique said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy and sudden manufactured exhaustion. "I have been thinking a lot about our family dynamics lately. About how you disappeared for 12 years without a single word. How you broke Mom and Dad's hearts by abandoning us." The bridesmaids stopped talking and looked over, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. I remained perfectly still, resting my hands in my lap. "I didn't abandon anyone, Monique. I removed myself from a toxic environment. There is a profound difference." Monique shook her head, adopting a deeply condescending tone. "You can call it whatever helps you sleep at night, Justine. But the truth is, you left a massive hole in this family. We worried about you. We prayed for you. And yesterday you showed up out of nowhere, creating drama and trying to tear down my husband's success just because you are struggling to make ends meet at some hotel." "Get to the point, Monique," I said flatly, dropping the polite facade. Monique smiled, her eyes cold and calculating. She slid the heavy leather folio across the low glass coffee table until it bumped against my sparkling water glass. "The point is, family requires sacrifice," Monique declared smoothly. "You owe us 12 years of missed birthdays, missed holidays, and missed support. You owe me an apology for your behavior last night. So I have decided to let you make it right. You can cover the spa bill today. Consider it your contribution to my vow renewal and your official apology gift to this family." Chelsea and the other bridesmaids gasped softly, exchanging wide-eyed, uncomfortable glances. Even they recognized the sheer cruelty of demanding a supposedly broke hospitality worker to pay a massive luxury bill. I looked down at the leather folio. I didn't need to open it to know the exact number, but I opened it anyway, just for the theater of it. $15,420. I looked back up at my sister. She was sitting back in her chair, her arms crossed, waiting for my inevitable breakdown. She was waiting for me to cry, to admit that I didn't have the money to beg for her forgiveness, so she could magnanimously offer to pay it herself and hold it over my head for the rest of my life. Or worse, she was hoping I would be forced to call our parents to bail me out, proving once and for all that I was a complete dependent failure. Instead of panicking, I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It started in my chest and echoed in the quiet luxury of the spa lounge. "An apology gift," I repeated, closing the folio and tracing the leather edge with my fingertip. "You want me to pay $15,000 to apologize for surviving the emotional abuse this family put me through. It's about taking responsibility, Justine," Monique said, her voice hardening when she realized I wasn't crying. "You want to be part of this family again? You have to pay the toll. Spencer and I are dealing with massive corporate restructuring right now, and my assets are temporarily tied up in the new funding round. You are going to cover this, or I am going to have security escort you off the property for theft of services." She was bluffing, completely cornered by her own husband's financial ruin. She literally did not have the funds to pay for the champagne she had just swallowed. I stood up slowly, smoothing down the front of my white robe. I picked up my small clutch from the side table and unzipped the hidden compartment. "You know, Monique, you are absolutely right about one thing," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Actions do have a toll." I pulled out my solid titanium matte black card. I didn't flaunt it. I simply held it between my index and middle fingers as I walked past the stunned bridesmaids and approached Elena, who was standing quietly near the door. "Elena," I said, keeping my tone perfectly professional. "I would like to settle my personal tab. Please charge the card for one basic deep tissue massage and one glass of sparkling water. The total should be roughly $250. Elena took the heavy metal card, her eyes widening slightly as she felt its weight and recognized the exclusive insignia. "Right away, ma'am." "Wait, what are you doing?" Monique demanded, jumping up from her chair, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You can't just pay for your water. I told you to cover the entire folio." I turned to face my sister, my expression entirely devoid of emotion. "I heard what you told me, Monique," I said coldly, "but I do not finance the delusions of grown women. I pay for exactly what I consume. The remaining $15,170 is entirely your responsibility." "You selfish witch!" Monique shrieked, dropping the serene bride persona completely. "I don't have my card on me. You are going to embarrass me in front of the resort staff. Pay the bill." I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice so only she could hear the absolute finality in my words. "You should really call Spencer to bring his credit card down here," I whispered sharply, "though I strongly suggest you ask him to bring 3 or 4 of them. From what I hear, his primary accounts are experiencing some severe, macro-level market disruption today." Monique physically recoiled, the blood draining completely from her face. Her mouth opened, but she couldn't formulate a single word. She realized in that horrifying second that I knew exactly how broke they really were. I took my black card back from Elena, signed my receipt, and slipped it into my clutch. "Thank you for the sisterly bonding, Monique," I said loud enough for the bridesmaids to hear. "It was incredibly illuminating. Good luck with the bill." I walked out of the Grand Orchid suite, leaving my sister standing frozen in a white robe, staring at a $15,000 invoice she had absolutely no way of paying. I navigated the winding botanical paths back toward the main building, pulling out my phone to text Elias. The trap snapped shut. "She's stranded at the spa with a massive bill." His reply came seconds later. "Beautiful. But brace yourself. Your mother is currently marching toward the service elevator wing. She looks like she wants to commit a felony." I locked my phone and slid it into my bag. Sylvia was coming. She was furious that I had dared to humiliate her precious golden child in front of her friends. I took a deep breath, letting the humid air fill my lungs, and headed back to my tiny vibrating closet of a room. I was not 22 anymore. I was ready for the war. The heavy vibration of the commercial washing machines beneath the floorboards hummed in my chest as I stepped into the cramped staff room. The space was barely large enough to fit a twin bed and a narrow dresser, but I felt more powerful standing on that cheap carpet than I ever had in my parents' sprawling home. I set my clutch down and took a slow breath, letting the adrenaline of the spa encounter settle. The quiet did not last long. Less than 5 minutes later, a violent pounding echoed against the thin wooden door. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, aggressive hammering of someone who felt entirely entitled to my space and my submission. Before I could even reach the handle, the door was shoved open. Sylvia stormed into the tiny room, bringing with her a suffocating wave of heavy floral perfume and absolute rage. Her face was flushed a deep, angry red, and her chest heaved as she slammed the door shut behind her. She did not look like a woman enjoying a luxury vacation. She looked like a cornered animal whose carefully constructed social standing had just been threatened. "How dare you!" Sylvia hissed, her voice trembling with a venom I remembered all too well. "How dare you humiliate your sister in front of her friends? Chelsea has a husband in finance, and you just made Monique look like a complete fool over a spa bill. Who do you think you are?" I stood perfectly still, watching her unravel. "I am someone who pays for her own sparkling water, Sylvia. If Monique cannot afford the lifestyle she is pretending to live, she should not order the vintage champagne." Sylvia took a step forward, her eyes blazing with irrational fury. "You vindictive little brat. We brought you here to extend an olive branch. We gave you a chance to apologize for abandoning this family, and this is how you repay us." You embarrass us. You owe your sister. You owe this family everything. Her temper spiked, overriding whatever fragile restraint she had left. In a flash of blind rage, Sylvia raised her hand, drawing it back to strike me across the face, just like she had done so many times when I was a teenager. But this time, the blow never landed. My hand shot up and my fingers closed around her wrist in an iron grip, stopping her hand mere inches from my cheek. Sylvia gasped, her eyes widening in absolute shock as she tried to pull her arm back, but I held her firmly in place. The physical contact was electric, charging the cramped room with years of unspoken resentment. "I am not 22 anymore, Sylvia," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "You do not get to put your hands on me. Ever again." Sylvia stared at me, her bravado fracturing as she realized the physical and psychological dynamic between us had permanently shifted. I released her wrist with a sharp motion, pushing her hand away. She stumbled back a step, rubbing her arm and looking at me as if I were a complete stranger. "You call me selfish," I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to back up against the cheap wooden door. "You stand there in your cheap resort wear and accuse me of abandoning this family. Let us talk about what really happened 12 years ago on the day of my college graduation. Let us talk about why you actually canceled my dinner." Sylvia lifted her chin, trying to recover her false authority. "I told you why. Spencer proposed and Monique was having a crisis." "Family comes first, Justine." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "A crisis over a diamond shape. Is that the lie you have been telling yourself for a decade to sleep at night?" "Because I know the truth, Sylvia. I have known the truth for a very long time." Sylvia frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing her face. "What are you talking about?" I crossed my arms over my chest, locking my eyes onto hers. "2 weeks before my graduation, you went to the local bank branch in Atlanta. You walked up to a teller who had known you for 20 years, and you forged my signature on the withdrawal slips for the college trust fund Grandpa left me. The trust fund I never touched because I worked 3 jobs to pay my own tuition so I could save that money to buy a house." The color drained entirely from Sylvia's face, leaving her looking gray and suddenly very old. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You drained $50,000 from my account, Sylvia," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "And you did not do it to help Monique with a ring. You did it because Spencer's first tech startup was a complete scam. He was drowning in offshore gambling debts and illegal margin calls. His investors were threatening to go to the police. You stole your own black daughter's future to buy a white man out of his criminal mistakes just so you could keep telling your friends at church that your eldest daughter was marrying a wealthy tech entrepreneur." How Sylvia whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the washing machines downstairs. "How did you know about that?" "I knew because the bank called me 3 days after I left Atlanta to verify a suspicious signature on the final closeout document," I replied, watching her carefully constructed world shatter piece by piece. "I could have sent you to federal prison for fraud, Sylvia. I could have had you arrested for grand larceny. But I chose to walk away because letting you tie yourself to a parasitic fraud like Spencer was a much worse punishment than anything a judge could hand down." Sylvia pressed her hands against the door behind her, visibly trembling. "You do not understand," she pleaded, dropping the aggressive posturing and switching instantly to the role of the desperate victim. "We had to protect the family image. Spencer had potential. He had the right background, the right connections. He was going to be our ticket to generational wealth. We thought he would pay it back tenfold once his company went public. You were always so smart, Justine. You always figured things out. We knew you would be fine, but Monique needed this." I stared at her, feeling a profound, sickening sense of pity. "You sold your own flesh and blood to buy proximity to whiteness and fake wealth. You stole my security so you could pretend to be elite. And look where it got you, Sylvia. You are standing in a glorified utility closet begging for my understanding while your golden son-in-law is out there drinking liquor he cannot afford on a property he does not own." Sylvia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, but I felt absolutely nothing for her. "You are a bitter, cruel girl," she whispered, crying tears of humiliation rather than remorse. "You have no idea the sacrifices we made." "I know exactly what you sacrificed," I said coldly. "You sacrificed me. And now you have to live with the consequences. Get out of my room." Sylvia fumbled blindly for the door handle, tears streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She pulled the door open and fled down the narrow hallway, retreating back to the illusions she was so desperate to protect. I stood alone in the quiet room, the heavy vibration of the floorboards the only movement in the space. My heart was pounding, a steady rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I had waited 12 years to say those words to her. 12 years of carrying the weight of that betrayal, silently letting them believe they had simply hurt my feelings, when in reality, they had committed a crime against my future. A few minutes passed as I allowed the adrenaline to slowly leave my system. I walked over to the small sink and splashed cold water on my face, taking a deep cleansing breath. The first strike had been delivered, and the structural integrity of their fake empire was already cracking. A soft, deliberate knock sounded at the door. 2 quick taps followed by a slow one. It was our signal. "Come in," I said, drying my hands on a towel. The door opened and Elias stepped into the cramped room. He had to duck his head slightly to clear the low door frame. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that looked entirely alien in the cheap staff quarters, but he carried himself with the effortless, predatory grace that made him so terrifying in a boardroom. He locked the door behind him and turned to me, his dark eyes scanning my face for any sign of distress. "Are you all right?" he asked, closing the distance between us and resting his hands gently on my waist. "I saw your mother running toward the main elevators, looking like she had just seen a ghost." I smiled, leaning into his touch for just a moment, drawing strength from his calm, solid presence. "I am perfectly fine." The ghost of her past just caught up to her. I told her I knew about the stolen college fund. Elias let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "I almost feel sorry for them. Almost." He stepped back and pulled a sleek, heavily encrypted tablet from the leather briefcase he was carrying. He tapped the screen a few times, bypassing the security protocols and bringing up a live dashboard of the Azure Resort's internal financial tracking system. "You were right about Spencer," Elias said, his voice shifting into pure business mode. "The man is drowning faster than we anticipated. Look at this." He handed me the tablet. The screen displayed a real-time ledger of the incidental charges associated with the Sterling Vow renewal party. Spencer had apparently gone straight from his racist speech on the terrace to the resort's premier steakhouse, demanding a private table and ordering bottles of imported wine for his groomsmen. I watched the screen as a series of red declined notifications flashed across the ledger. "He tried to use an American Express black card first," Elias explained, pointing to the timestamp. "Declined for suspicious activity. Then he tried a corporate visa. Declined for insufficient funds. He eventually had to use a basic debit card just to cover the appetizers, and the system flagged it because the account balance is dangerously low." I scrolled down the list of alerts, feeling a sharp thrill of anticipation. "He is completely maxed out. He does not have the liquidity to pay for a single night in that luxury suite, let alone the entire weekend." "It gets better," Elias said, pulling up another screen containing highly confidential background reports. "Our intelligence team finished the deep dive on his tech company. It is not just a shell game, Justine. It is a full-blown Ponzi scheme. He has been taking venture capital money and using it to pay off early investors while siphoning millions into offshore accounts to fund his lifestyle. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened a quiet investigation 3 months ago, and the FBI is currently reviewing the wire transfers. The man is looking at 20 years in federal prison." I handed the tablet back to Elias, my mind calculating the final moves of this elaborate chess match. "He is cornered, and a cornered man is going to look for a miracle." Elias smiled a sharp, knowing expression. "He is already looking for one." 10 minutes ago, Spencer approached the front desk concierge, sweating through his linen shirt. He demanded to know if the owner of Oasis Crown Holdings was currently on the property. He claimed he has a revolutionary tech proposal and needs an emergency meeting with the CEO to discuss a highly lucrative partnership. I laughed aloud, the sound bright and clear in the tiny room. "He wants to pitch me a bailout. He wants to scam my company to save himself from federal indictment." "He is desperate," Elias agreed, slipping the tablet back into his briefcase. "He thinks if he can secure a letter of intent from a billionaire hospitality group, he can leverage it to hold off his creditors and the feds." He has absolutely no idea that the shadow CEO he is desperately trying to court is the exact same black woman he was mocking on the terrace an hour ago. I walked over to the small frosted window and looked out at the sliver of gray sky visible above the resort. The trap was perfectly set. Every piece was exactly where it needed to be. Sylvia was unraveling under the weight of her exposed crimes. Monique was stranded in her fake luxury facing bills she could not comprehend. And Spencer was blindly begging his own victim for a lifeline. "Go back to the executive suite, Elias," I said, turning to face the man I loved. "Keep monitoring the charges. Do not block any of their purchases. Let them rack up the most astronomical bill this resort has ever seen." "What is your next move?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "I am going to take a walk through the gardens," I said, grabbing my simple clutch and smoothing down my silk dress. "I think it is time I casually cross paths with my desperate brother-in-law and see just how far he is willing to degrade himself when he thinks no one important is watching." Elias kissed my forehead, a promise of the victory to come. "Happy hunting, Madam CEO." I stepped out of the vibrating closet and walked back into the opulent, polished world I owned, ready to watch the Sterling Empire burn to the ground. I left the cramped staff room and navigated the labyrinth of polished marble corridors that connected the service wing to the primary guest areas. The air conditioning blew a steady, cool breeze, but the atmosphere in the resort felt thick with impending disaster. I walked with purpose, my soft leather sandals making no sound against the imported stone floors. As I rounded the corner toward the executive management suites, I heard a voice raised in frantic, aggressive desperation. It was Spencer. He was standing outside the heavy mahogany double doors of the executive office, waving his arms wildly at my director of guest relations, a remarkably patient man named David. Spencer looked absolutely atrocious. His expensive linen shirt was completely soaked with sweat under the arms, and his face was flushed a dangerous shade of magenta. He looked exactly like a man who knew the federal government was actively examining his offshore bank accounts. "You are not listening to me," David Spencer shouted, stabbing his finger in the air. "I do not need to schedule an appointment through a generic corporate email portal. I am telling you that my venture capital firm is prepared to offer Oasis Crown Holdings an exclusive ground floor entry into a multi-million-dollar software integration package. I know the owner of this resort is currently on the property. My sources confirmed it. I need 10 minutes face-to-face with the CEO right now." David remained perfectly still, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. His voice was a masterclass in hospitality industry deflection. "Sir, I completely understand your urgency, but as I have explained, our chief executive officer does not take unsolicited pitch meetings while inspecting private properties. If you would like to leave your contact information, I can forward your proposal to our corporate acquisitions team in Atlanta." Spencer let out a loud, dramatic groan of frustration, dragging both hands through his thinning hair. "You people are completely incompetent. This is why corporate hospitality is a dying sector. You have no vision. I am offering your boss a golden ticket and you are giving me administrative red tape. Do you have any idea who I am?" I slowed my pace deliberately, choosing to walk directly past the escalating scene. I kept my posture relaxed, my gaze focused straight ahead. Justine Spencer snapped, his voice dripping with condescension the moment he spotted me in the corridor. "Get out of the way. The adults are trying to conduct real business here, and we do not have time for the cleaning staff to be loitering in the executive wing." I stopped and turned my head slowly to look at him. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands were physically trembling. He was a pathetic, desperate animal lashing out at the only person he believed was lower on the food chain than he was. "I am just passing through, Spencer," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. "Good luck with your business pitch. I hear the executive team here is incredibly selective about who they partner with. They require verified liquidity." Spencer sneered at me, stepping closer so he could look down his nose at me. "What would you know about liquidity, you broke, pathetic loser? You have been answering phones at budget motels for a decade. Go find a mop and make yourself useful before I have David here." Write you up for harassing a premium guest. I smiled a genuine wide smile that seemed to confuse him deeply. I will leave you to your very important meeting, Spencer. I am sure the CEO will be thrilled to hear all about your revolutionary shell company. I turned and walked away before he could process the specific phrasing of my insult. I could feel his angry, bloodshot eyes boring into my back, but I did not falter. He was completely oblivious that the very person he was desperately begging for a corporate bailout had just smiled in his face and walked away. I exited the main building and stepped out into the sprawling botanical gardens that separated the main lobby from the private beach villas. The air was thick with the heavy, humid heat of a Florida evening and the sweet, overwhelming scent of night-blooming jasmine. I had personally approved the landscaping budget for this specific property just 3 weeks ago. Every manicured palm tree, every perfectly placed limestone pathway was a testament to the empire I had built, while my family assumed I was rotting away in poverty. I walked slowly, letting the tropical breeze cool my skin. I needed a moment of absolute quiet to process the sheer absurdity of the situation, but the universe had other plans for my evening walk. As I approached the secluded koi pond near the eastern edge of the gardens, I heard the sharp, frantic sounds of a whispered argument. The voices were instantly recognizable. It was my mother and father. I stepped silently off the crushed gravel path and moved behind a thick, dense cluster of flowering hibiscus bushes. Through the broad green leaves, I had a clear, unobstructed view of Sylvia and Calvin. They did not look like the confident, arrogant people who had just gleefully downgraded my hotel room to a utility closet. They looked exactly like cornered, terrified prey. Calvin was pacing back and forth near the edge of the dark water, his hands shaking violently as he clutched his cell phone to his chest. His face was pale and slick with a heavy, nervous sweat. "What are we going to do, Sylvia?" He hissed, his voice cracking with a raw, unfiltered terror I had never heard from him before. That was the bank calling again. They are threatening to accelerate the foreclosure process on the house if we do not make the balloon payment by the end of the month. We are completely out of time. Sylvia rushed forward and grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into his expensive linen sleeve. "Keep your voice down, Calvin," she whispered fiercely, her eyes darting around the empty, illuminated garden paths. "Someone will hear you. We just need to get through this weekend." Once the vow renewal is over, Spencer promised he would handle the rest of the resort bill. He told me his tech company is closing a massive funding round on Monday. We just need to hold on until he signs the final check at checkout. Calvin let out a choked, desperate sound that bordered on a suffocating sob. "We took out a reverse mortgage on the house, Sylvia. We took every last dime of equity we had left just to pay the $50,000 non-refundable deposit for this ridiculous party. We are completely broke. If Spencer does not pay the remaining $250,000 balance tomorrow afternoon, this resort is going to call the police on us for theft of services. We will go to jail, Sylvia. We will lose everything we have ever worked for." The humid Florida air suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. I stood perfectly still behind the hibiscus bushes, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer, staggering magnitude of their financial suicide. My parents, the people who had flatly refused to co-sign a basic student loan for my college education, the people who had maliciously forged my signature to drain my small savings account, had just secretly mortgaged their entire home. They had literally risked their shelter, their retirement, their entire existence just to pay the deposit for a vow renewal. "We had to do it. Calvin?" Sylvia hissed, her voice vibrating with a sick, desperate delusion. Richard and Margaret were expecting a luxury experience. They would have judged us forever if we had hosted this anniversary at some cheap local banquet hall in Atlanta. You know how Spencer's parents are. They come from old money. They expect a certain caliber of lifestyle. We have to look like we belong in their world. Spencer is going to be a billionaire soon. He will take care of us. He promised he would buy us a new estate in the Hamptons once his company goes public. We just have to play the part until then. He is a liar. Sylvia. Calvin groaned, dropping his heavy head into his hands. His credit cards are declining at the bar. I saw him fighting with a waiter over a declined transaction just an hour ago. He was sweating and screaming at the poor kid, calling him incompetent. What if he does not have the money? What if his company is fake? What if we lose the house for absolutely nothing? He has the money! Sylvia snapped, her denial absolute and terrifying. He has to have the money. Do not do this to me, Calvin. Do not ruin my daughter's perfect weekend with your negativity and your pathetic paranoia. Everything is going to be fine. We just have to keep up appearances until the ceremony is over. Spencer is a white man in tech. He always gets the money. They always fail upward. I slowly backed away from the bushes, my leather sandals making absolutely no sound on the soft, damp grass. The sheer pathetic reality of their situation was almost hard to swallow. They had sacrificed their own flesh and blood to buy proximity to whiteness and fake wealth. They were banking their entire existence on a man who was currently being hunted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for running a massive Ponzi scheme. They were holding on to the illusion of elite status so tightly that it was dragging them straight to the bottom of the ocean. I pulled my phone from my clutch and walked quickly back toward the main resort building, my fingers flying across the glowing screen as I typed out a secure, encrypted message to Elias. "It is worse than we thought," I wrote. My parents paid the $50,000 deposit with a reverse mortgage on their home. They think Spencer is paying the $250,000 final balance tomorrow. They are all completely broke. They are drowning themselves for optics. Elias replied less than 30 seconds later. His message was cold, calculated, and deeply satisfying. Copy that. Madam CEO. Our financial intelligence team just ran a deep background check on their primary residence in Atlanta. The bank initiated pre-foreclosure status 3 days ago. Your parents are literally dancing on the edge of a cliff. They sold the house you grew up in just to buy Spencer a few hours of fake luxury. The next morning, the tropical Florida heat rose early, baking the resort in a golden, oppressive light. The vow renewal ceremony was scheduled for the late afternoon, but the grotesque theater of their fake opulence began at breakfast. I sat alone at a small corner table in the resort's premium oceanfront cafe, sipping black coffee and watching the toxic dynamics unfold across the dining room. Spencer's parents, Richard and Margaret, were seated at the absolute center table, loudly demanding the attention of 3 separate waiters. Margaret was a thin, severe woman who wore her generational wealth like a heavy weapon. Richard was red-faced and obnoxiously loud, complaining about the humidity and the unacceptable quality of the imported smoked salmon. Sylvia and Calvin hovered nervously near their table, looking exactly like anxious, desperate courtiers trying to appease an angry king and queen. I watched in silent disgust as Margaret blatantly ignored Sylvia, who was desperately trying to strike up a friendly conversation about the customized floral arrangements. Margaret simply turned her back on my mother, treating her like an unwanted hired servant rather than family. When a server accidentally spilled a tiny drop of iced water near Richard's glass, Richard snapped his fingers at Calvin, signaling my father to pass him a cloth napkin as if my dad was the busboy. And yet Calvin and Sylvia just took it. They smiled tightly, swallowing their pride and their dignity, enduring the blatant racial and classist disrespect just to stay in the perceived proximity of that old Boston money. They were letting themselves be degraded, humiliated, and openly mocked by these entitled white people, all because they fiercely believed Spencer was going to hand them a winning lottery ticket. They had traded their daughter for a seat at a table where they were not even respected. Monique glided into the cafe a few minutes later, wearing a silk designer robe and oversized sunglasses, acting as though the paparazzi were hiding in the palm trees. She immediately flanked her mother-in-law, laughing too loudly at a joke Margaret made about the resort staff. Monique caught my eye from across the room and deliberately turned her head away, lifting her chin in a profound display of superiority. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that her husband was bankrupting her family to pay for the very breakfast she was about to eat. Watching them grovel solidified every single plan I had put in motion. There would be no last-minute mercy. There would be no secret corporate bailout. They had made their bed with lies, theft, and desperate social climbing, and now they were going to sleep in it. My mother had called me the strong one all those years ago, expecting me to absorb their abuse in silence. She was about to find out exactly how strong I had become. As the morning stretched into the early afternoon, the resort buzzed with the frenetic, anxious energy of the upcoming ceremony. Vendors were rushing through the service corridors carrying towering arrangements of white orchids and massive tiered wedding cakes. The bill was racking up by the minute. Every single bottle of vintage champagne opened in the bridal suite. Every customized craft cocktail served to the groomsmen was adding to a catastrophic final total that none of them could afford. I slipped away from the public areas and took the private executive elevator up to the restricted management suites. Mr. Harrison was waiting for me in his secure corner office, looking intensely focused as he monitored the live ledger of the Sterling event account. The numbers on his dual monitors were ticking higher and higher, a digital countdown to absolute financial ruin. "Madame CEO," Mr. Harrison said, standing up respectfully, smoothing his tailored jacket as I entered the room. "The final event preparations are complete. The current outstanding balance for the Sterling party, including the luxury suites, the open bar tab, the spa treatments, and the ballroom catering, is exactly $253,400. The final bill will be automatically generated at the conclusion of the reception this evening." I walked slowly over to the glowing monitors and stared at the bright red numbers glaring on the screen. The trap was perfectly set. The guillotine was raised high above their heads, and they were all marching blindly toward the block, completely hypnotized by their own delusions of grandeur. I turned to look Mr. Harrison directly in the eyes, my voice cold, absolute, and completely devoid of mercy. "Mr. Harrison," I said slowly, ensuring he understood the severe gravity of my command. "When that reception ends, you will generate that final invoice and present it directly to Spencer Sterling. And no matter what happens, no matter how much they beg or scream or threaten, do not let them leave this property without paying every single cent." I left the executive office and took the private elevator back down to the ground floor. The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast a warm golden glow over the Azure Resort, but there was absolutely nothing warm about the cold, hard reality waiting for my family. Elias met me at the edge of the grand lawn, where the outdoor vow renewal ceremony had been meticulously assembled. He handed me a flute of crystal-clear vintage champagne and offered me his arm. The ceremony space was a grotesque display of unearned, fake opulence. Monique had demanded a custom-built platform constructed directly over the edge of the private beach, so it would appear as though she and Spencer were floating on the ocean. Thousands of imported white orchids were woven into a massive floral arch that framed the altar. A 12-piece string quartet sat on a raised dais, playing classical renditions of modern pop songs. Every single chair was draped in sheer white silk and tied with gold ribbon. It was a scene ripped straight out of a billionaire lifestyle magazine, except every single petal, every chair, every drop of champagne was bought with stolen money and false promises. Elias and I took our seats in the very back row, completely hidden from the main line of sight. We sat quietly, sipping our champagne and watching the guests file into the seating area. There were perhaps 100 people in attendance, mostly Spencer's sycophant friends from the tech world, and a few minor local socialites my mother had desperately scrambled to invite just to pad the guest list. Then the music shifted to a dramatic swelling crescendo, and the bridal procession began. Monique appeared at the end of the long white aisle, and I actually had to suppress a harsh laugh. She was wearing a custom couture gown that easily cost $20,000. It was a massive, heavy creation of layered tulle, imported French lace, and thousands of hand-sewn Swarovski crystals that caught the fading sunlight and practically blinded anyone looking directly at her. She had a cathedral-length veil trailing 10 feet behind her, dragging across the pristine white carpet. She looked incredibly beautiful and utterly ridiculous. She was walking down an aisle built on my property, wearing a dress paid for by the reverse mortgage of my parents' home, to renew her vows to a man who was about to be federally indicted. It was the most pathetic tragedy I had ever witnessed, disguised as a fairy tale. Sylvia and Calvin sat in the front row on the bride's side, looking physically ill beneath their forced, plastered smiles. Sylvia was clutching a lace handkerchief, dabbing at dry eyes while Calvin sat rigid, his posture stiff with the terrifying knowledge of their impending financial doom. Across the aisle sat Richard and Margaret Spencer's parents. They sat with their legs crossed, looking around the elaborate setup with expressions of mild distaste, as if the entire event was somehow beneath their aristocratic Boston standards. The dynamic between the two sets of parents was painful to watch. Earlier, as the guests were being seated, I had watched Margaret drop her silk shawl onto the grass. Instead of picking it up herself, she had simply snapped her fingers and pointed at it, looking directly at Sylvia. And my mother, the woman who had terrorized me my entire life for not being perfect enough, had actually bent down, picked up the shawl, and handed it back to Margaret, with a subservient, apologetic smile. Margaret had not even said thank you. She had just taken the shawl and turned her back. Calvin had endured similar humiliations. Richard had loudly complained that the sun was in his eyes and suggested that Calvin go find a resort employee to move the heavy floral arrangements to block the glare. Calvin, the proud patriarch who used to demand absolute respect in our household, had meekly scurried off to find a waiter nodding along to Richard's condescending tone. They were taking the disrespect, swallowing the blatant racial and classist microaggressions because they were utterly desperate to stay proximate to whiteness and perceived wealth. They believed that tolerating this abuse was the price of admission to elite society. Spencer stood at the altar waiting for Monique. He was sweating through his custom tuxedo, his face glistening with a combination of high humidity and deep internal panic. When Monique finally reached him, he took her hands and the officiant began the ceremony. When it was time for the vows, Spencer took the microphone. His speech was a sickeningly sweet, entirely fabricated monologue designed solely to stroke his own fragile ego in front of his wealthy parents. Monique, he began, his voice booming over the speakers. 10 years ago, I promised to love you, and today, I stand here promising to continue building our empire. A man is measured by his ability to be a provider to shield his family from the harsh realities of the world and to elevate them to the highest peaks of success. Looking at you today, surrounded by this incredible luxury that I have secured for our future, I know that my vision is absolute. We are scaling our love the same way I scale my businesses with aggressive passion and untouchable foresight. I am your protector, your provider, and your king, provider. I took a slow sip of my champagne, feeling the dry bubbles pop against my tongue. Elias leaned over his shoulder, pressing against mine. Building an empire, Elias whispered, his voice laced with dark amusement. The only thing he is building is a compelling case for the prosecution. I smirked, keeping my eyes on the altar. Monique wept fake tears, wiping her eyes carefully to avoid ruining her professional makeup. She took the microphone and delivered an equally delusional speech about how blessed she was to be married to a true visionary, a man who gave her a life of unimaginable privilege. She thanked our parents for instilling in her the grace and elegance required to stand beside a titan of industry. The sheer delusion was suffocating. They exchanged new platinum rings, kissed for the cameras, and walked back down the aisle together, while the string quartet played a triumphant classical march. The guests stood and applauded, completely ignorant of the fact that the titan of industry walking past them was a desperate criminal relying on his black-in-laws to fund his luxury charade. After the ceremony, the guests were ushered into the grand ballroom for the opulent reception. The ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland despite the Florida heat. Crystal trees dripped with white floral arrangements, and the tables were set with gold-rimmed charger plates and heavy sterling silver cutlery. A 10-piece jazz band played smooth music on the main stage, and waiters circulated with silver trays offering fresh oyster hors d'oeuvres and top-shelf cocktails. I walked into the ballroom with Elias, choosing a small, high-top table near the expansive glass doors that opened out to the lobby corridor. We had a perfect vantage point of the entire room. Monique and Spencer made their grand entrance to roaring applause, taking their seats at a raised sweetheart table covered in white roses. The dinner service was an agonizingly long affair of forced laughter and tense interactions. I watched from afar as Richard and Margaret refused to sit at the same table as Sylvia and Calvin. They had complained to the catering manager that they required a private table closer to the jazz band, away from the bride's family. Sylvia and Calvin were relegated to a smaller table near the kitchen doors, sitting alone with their untouched plates of filet mignon. They looked completely defeated, entirely isolated at their own daughter's event. Their reverse mortgage, their sacrificed home, had bought them nothing but a seat by the kitchen and the open disdain of the people they were trying to impress. As the dinner plates were cleared away and the band shifted to a more upbeat tempo for dancing, the atmosphere in the room began to crack. The illusion was reaching its absolute expiration date. Spencer kept leaving the sweetheart table to pace nervously in the hallway, frantically checking his phone and making hushed, panicked calls. He was trying to secure a last-minute miracle, a wire transfer, a loan, anything to cover the looming $250,000 balance that he knew was coming. Monique remained at the table, drinking heavily, her perfect smile becoming increasingly strained as guests asked her about Spencer's sudden absences. She deflected with practiced ease, claiming he was handling urgent multi-million-dollar international business calls. Elias touched my hand, drawing my attention away from the sweetheart table. He nodded subtly toward the massive glass doors that separated the ballroom from the main resort lobby. "Look," Elias murmured, his voice low and intensely focused. "The guests of honor have arrived." I turned my gaze toward the grand lobby. The heavy mahogany front doors of the Azure Resort slid open. Two men walked into the brightly lit foyer. They were not dressed in resort wear, and they were not wearing tuxedos for the vow renewal. They wore sharp, dark charcoal suits with standard-issue blue ties. Their posture was rigid, their movements highly coordinated and purposeful. Their eyes scanned the lobby with the cold, clinical efficiency of predators seeking a specific target. They walked past the floral displays and the concierge desk, completely ignoring the luxurious surroundings. One of them reached into his inner suit jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flashing a gold shield to the security guard stationed near the lobby entrance. The guard immediately stepped aside, pointing a discreet finger directly toward the grand ballroom where the reception was taking place. I felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face. The jazz music continued to play, filling the ballroom with cheerful, upbeat melodies. Guests were laughing and clinking glasses, oblivious to the impending destruction. Sylvia was staring blankly at her half-empty water glass, her mind probably calculating exactly how many days she had left before the bank evicted her. Spencer was making his way back to the sweetheart table, wiping sweat from his forehead with a cloth napkin. They had no idea what was walking through the doors. They had no idea that the empire they had sacrificed everything to build was about to be seized. The federal agents stepped into the corridor leading to the ballroom, their dark suits a stark contrast to the white floral arrangements lining the hallway. The final act of my revenge had officially walked into the building. The federal agents stood near the entrance of the ballroom, their dark suits blending into the shadows of the corridor. They did not rush in. They were seasoned professionals who knew their target was not going anywhere. Spencer was trapped in a room with only 2 exits, and they had both covered. I watched them from my high-top table near the glass doors, taking a slow sip of my vintage champagne. The jazz band on the main stage transitioned into a lively, upbeat number, filling the massive space with a cheerful rhythm that completely contradicted the impending doom. The ballroom was a grotesque monument to financial delusion. The massive ice sculptures carved into the shapes of swans were beginning to sweat under the heat of the expensive stage lighting, dripping water onto the silk tablecloths. The remnants of a wildly overpriced dinner sat on fine bone china plates, while guests mingled and laughed, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire event was a giant crime scene. At the sweetheart table, Spencer was leaning back in his chair, trying desperately to project the image of a relaxed billionaire. His tuxedo shirt was clinging to his chest, dark patches of nervous sweat staining the expensive fabric under his arms. Monique sat beside him, touching up her lipstick in a small compact mirror, completely lost in her own vanity. She adjusted her $20,000 gown, making sure the thousands of crystals caught the light just right. She thought she was the queen of the world sitting on a throne built on my parents' stolen home equity. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the kitchen doors. Mr. Harrison, the general manager, emerged holding a thick black leather folio against his chest. He walked with the rigid, precise posture of a man carrying a bomb. The waitstaff instinctively parted for him, recognizing the specific leather folder that contained the final reckoning for the weekend. I tracked his progress across the polished dance floor. He did not look at me, but I could feel his tension from across the room. Mr. Harrison reached the raised platform of the sweetheart table. He stepped up the small stairs and approached Spencer. The guests seated at the tables immediately surrounding the bridal party continued to talk loudly, their conversations masking the initial interaction. Sir Mr. Harrison said, his voice perfectly modulated to carry just far enough for Spencer and Monique to hear. "I have the final invoice for the weekend festivities. As per our standard resort policy, we require full settlement of the remaining balance before the ceremonial cutting of the cake." Spencer waved his hand in a grand, dismissive gesture. He did not even bother to look down at the black leather folio. He wanted to show off for his wealthy parents, who were seated at the adjacent VIP table. Richard and Margaret had paused their conversation to watch the exchange. Spencer reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a heavy metal credit card, tossing it carelessly onto the table so that it clattered against a crystal water glass. "Just run it and keep the drinks flowing for my guests," Spencer boasted, a smug, arrogant smile twisting his lips. Mr. Harrison picked up the heavy metal card. He pulled a sleek wireless payment terminal from his suit pocket and slid the card through the magnetic reader. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath for a fraction of a second. A sharp, loud electronic beep echoed over the smooth jazz music. "Declined," Sir Mr. Harrison said, his tone absolutely devoid of judgment, but loud enough that Richard and Margaret definitely heard the word. Spencer frowned, the smug smile instantly vanishing from his face. A sudden angry red flush crept up his neck and settled in his cheeks. He leaned forward, snatching the card out of Mr. Harrison's hand. "Run it again," he snapped, his voice sharp and aggressive. "The machine is obviously broken or the connection is bad. This is an exclusive black card. There are no limits on this account." Mr. Harrison took the card back and swiped it a second time. The terminal processed for a moment before issuing another sharp, loud beep. "The transaction has been declined by the issuing institution, sir," Mr. Harrison repeated calmly. Spencer began to sweat profusely. Drops of moisture gathered on his forehead and his hands started to tremble visibly. He opened his wallet again, his fingers fumbling with the leather slots. "This is a mistake," he stammered, avoiding the piercing glare of his father sitting just a few feet away. "My bank must have put a fraud hold on the account because of the massive amount. They are always overly cautious with my wealth. Let me just use my corporate account." He handed Mr. Harrison a different card. Mr. Harrison swiped it. A third sharp beep cut through the air. "Declined, sir," Mr. Harrison said. "Do you have an alternative method of payment for the $250,000 balance?" The number hung in the air like a physical weight suspended over the sweetheart table. $250,000. Richard and Margaret froze completely. The wealthy Boston aristocrats who had spent the entire weekend looking down their noses at my family turned to stare at their own son in absolute horrific shock. Margaret let out a loud, disgusted gasp, dropping her linen napkin onto her plate. Richard stood up from his chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. His face was dark with a furious, humiliated rage. "What is the exact meaning of this, Spencer?" Richard demanded, his booming voice carrying over the music and drawing the attention of several nearby tables. "Why are your elite accounts frozen? Are you bankrupt?" Spencer held his trembling hands up defensively, physically shrinking under his father's furious gaze. "No, Dad, I swear to you, it is just a minor liquidity issue with the new funding round. The venture capital money is temporarily tied up in escrow for the software acquisition. I just need a simple wire transfer to cover this little misunderstanding." Margaret stood up, her face contorted with sheer aristocratic revulsion. She grabbed her designer evening bag, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "You lied to us!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at Monique, and then aggressively pointing toward my parents' table near the kitchen doors. "You dragged us down to this tacky Florida resort, pretending you were building some massive tech empire, and you cannot even pay for your own cheap wedding cake. You are a complete fraud, Spencer." "Dad, Mom, please just listen to me," Spencer begged, his voice cracking in pathetic desperation. "We are leaving right now," Richard barked, cutting off his son's excuses. Richard grabbed Margaret by the arm, and the two of them turned their backs on the sweetheart table. They stormed across the ballroom, shoving past confused guests, completely and utterly abandoning their son to his financial ruin without a single backward glance. They walked straight past the federal agents in the hallway, too blinded by their own upper-class embarrassment to even notice the law enforcement officers waiting in the shadows. At the sweetheart table, Monique's perfect illusion finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked down at the black leather folio and then up at her sweating, trembling husband. She burst into loud, hysterical tears, burying her face in her hands as her fairy tale dissolved into a public, humiliating nightmare. Her mascara smeared her $20,000 dress, suddenly looking like a ridiculous, heavy costume. Across the room, at their isolated table near the kitchen doors, Sylvia and Calvin watched the entire scene unfold with sheer, unadulterated terror. They froze completely, the blood draining so rapidly from their faces that they looked like corpses. The horrific reality of their situation crashed down on them with the force of a falling building. The reverse mortgage on their home was gone. The $50,000 deposit was gone. The white son-in-law, who was supposed to be their golden ticket to the Hamptons, was standing at the altar of his own destruction, entirely broke and publicly humiliated. The bill could not be paid. The resort was going to call the police. They were going to lose everything they had ever worked for in their entire lives. Spencer was hyperventilating now, clutching the edge of the sweetheart table as Mr. Harrison stood silently waiting for payment. Spencer looked like a trapped animal desperately searching the room for an escape route that did not exist. But it was Sylvia who truly lost her mind. The massive illusion she had sacrificed her entire existence to build the social standing she had abused me for decades to protect was collapsing in front of hundreds of people. Her brain simply could not process the failure. She refused to accept that her golden child had married a destitute criminal. She needed a scapegoat. She needed a savior. She needed the one person she always used to fix her problems or absorb her abuse. Sylvia frantically scanned the crowded ballroom, her eyes wide and wild with a sick, manic terror, until they locked onto me. I was still standing calmly near the glass doors with Elias, watching the destruction with total emotional detachment. A sudden surge of desperate, unhinged energy overtook my mother. She pushed her chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. She rushed across the ballroom, her high heels clicking loudly and aggressively against the polished wood. She shoved past waiters and confused guests, ignoring their startled gasps. She reached me in seconds and grabbed my arm with a crushing, frantic grip, her fingernails digging painfully into my skin through the silk of my simple dress. "Justine!" She screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, entirely devoid of any social grace or dignity. She was screaming so loudly that the sound tore through the general chatter of the room, drawing the immediate attention of every single guest in the ballroom. "You work in hospitality," she shrieked, shaking my arm violently. "You have to know people here. Go to the manager right now, Justine. Use your connections and make them defer this bill. Tell them you work for the corporate office or something. Tell them we are good for the money." I looked down at her hand, digging into my arm, and then up at her panicked, tear-stained face. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her with a cold, dead expression. She shook my arm again, her desperation turning into aggressive entitlement. "If you do not fix this right now, you have to take out a loan to pay it," she screamed, spit flying from her lips. "You owe this family your life, Justine. We gave you everything. Do not just stand there smiling at me. Do something. Fix this right now." The jazz band on the main stage stumbled over their instruments. The saxophone player stopped mid-note. The DJ, recognizing the severity of the escalating scene, abruptly cut the background track. The music stopped entirely. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom was absolute and suffocating. The clinking of glasses ceased. The quiet murmurs of conversation died in the throats of the guests. Every single person in the massive room turned to stare at the scene unfolding near the glass doors. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were locked onto my mother, a woman dressed in cheap, loud floral resort wear, screaming hysterically at her calm, composed daughter to commit financial fraud to save a fake billionaire. Elias shifted his weight slightly beside me, stepping just an inch closer. His physical presence, a silent warning to my mother that her physical aggression would not be tolerated much longer. But I held up a single finger, signaling Elias to wait. I wanted to savor this exact moment. Sylvia was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me, expecting me to crumble under her public pressure, just like I had done when I was a child. She expected me to scramble to the front desk, to beg the manager on my knees, to sacrifice my own non-existent credit score, to save her precious Monique from embarrassment. She firmly believed that the sheer force of her maternal rage in a public setting would force me back into my designated role as the family workhorse. She stared at me, waiting for my submission. The entire ballroom stared at us, waiting for the resolution of the horrific family drama. Spencer watched from the sweetheart table, his face pale and dripping with sweat, hoping against hope that the sister-in-law he had just mocked would somehow provide him with a miraculous escape hatch. I did not speak. I let the dead, heavy silence stretch out for 10 agonizing seconds. I let Sylvia feel the crushing weight of hundreds of judgmental eyes burning into her skin. I let her feel the absolute humiliation of begging the daughter she despised for $250,000 bailout. The federal agents in the hallway took a single step forward, moving out of the shadows and into the bright light of the lobby corridor, their presence now fully visible through the glass doors behind me. They were ready. The net was drawn tight. The climax of 12 years of pain, 12 years of hard, relentless work, 12 years of strategic silent waiting was finally here. The bomb had been dropped and the fuse had completely burned down to the absolute end. Sylvia's grip on my arm began to tremble as she registered the total lack of fear in my eyes. Her screaming demands echoed in her own ears, and the dreadful realization that she had absolutely no power over me slowly began to dawn on her panicked mind. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the cool air conditioning of the ballroom contrasting sharply with the heated, frantic energy radiating from my mother. I could smell the stale wine on her breath, mingled with her heavy, overpowering floral perfume. She was a woman entirely consumed by the facade she had built. And now that the facade was crumbling, she was trying to drag me down into the rubble with her. Monique was still sobbing at the sweetheart table, her face buried in her hands, her expensive veil tangled around her shoulders like a discarded fishing net. The guests near her were whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting between the crying bride, the sweating groom, and the screaming mother at the back of the room. The elite social standing my family had sacrificed everything to attain was dissolving into a cheap, tacky reality television spectacle. Calvin remained frozen at his table near the kitchen doors, unable to even stand up and intervene. He had completely surrendered his role as the patriarch, broken by his own cowardly decisions and his complicity in my mother's abuse. He watched his wife humiliate herself, and he did absolutely nothing. This was the legacy of the sterling vow renewal. A room full of fake friends, a mountain of insurmountable debt, a groom facing federal prison, and a family tearing itself apart in front of an audience. I let my eyes sweep across the ballroom, taking in every single detail of the scene. This was exactly what I had planned for. This was the exact moment I had envisioned when I packed my bags in that sweltering dorm room 12 years ago. Sylvia squeezed my arm one last time, her voice dropping to a desperate, pleading whisper that was somehow even more pathetic than her screaming. "Please, Justine." She begged, her eyes wide with terror. "Please, just fix it." I smiled. A slow, cold, calculating smile that promised absolutely no mercy. The time for fixing their mistakes had passed long ago. Now it was time for consequences. I calmly lifted my hand and peeled Sylvia's trembling fingers off my arm one by one. Her skin was clammy and cold, a stark physical manifestation of her escalating panic. I did not say a single word to her. I simply dropped her hand as if it were a piece of trash and turned my back on her frantic, panting form. I began a slow, deliberate walk toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. Elias moved perfectly in sync with me, remaining just a half step behind a silent, terrifying guardian in a bespoke navy suit. My footsteps echoed against the polished hardwood floor, cutting sharply through the dead-heavy silence of the massive room. The guests parted like the Red Sea as I moved through the tables. They pulled their chairs in and held their breath, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. I climbed the 3 short carpeted steps to the main stage. The jazz band musicians stepped back nervously, clutching their brass instruments. I approached the DJ booth and pulled the silver microphone from its heavy metal stand. I turned around to face the crowd looking out over the sea of frozen, horrified faces. My gaze swept past the hundreds of guests, past my hyperventilating mother, past my pathetic father, and locked directly onto the resort manager. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice ringing crystal clear and dangerously calm through the massive overhead speakers. "Could you please inform the ballroom of the standard operating protocol for guests who are entirely unable to settle their final accounts?" Mr. Harrison stepped forward, leaving Spencer hyperventilating at the sweetheart table. The manager walked to the center of the dance floor and turned to face the stage. He smoothed the front of his impeccable suit jacket, took a deep breath, and bowed deeply from the waist. It was a perfect 90-degree angle of absolute profound professional submission. "Whatever you command, Madam CEO." Mr. Harrison said, his voice booming with absolute clarity across the silent room. "You own the resort." The shockwave that hit the ballroom was a physical, tangible force. The air actually seemed to buckle under the sheer weight of the revelation. At the sweetheart table, Monique's fingers went completely slack. The vintage crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp and plummeted toward the floor. It shattered into 100 sparkling pieces against the polished wood, a sharp, violent sound that perfectly mimicked the shattering of her entire fake reality. Near the kitchen doors, Calvin's knees simply gave out. The last remaining threads of his pride snapped, and he collapsed heavily into a dining chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. He looked like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. Spencer turned a ghastly, sickening shade of chalk white. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified hollow corpse in a rented tuxedo. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, his brain completely short-circuiting as he realized that the broke hospitality worker he had been relentlessly mocking all weekend was actually the apex predator of his financial ecosystem. But I was not quite finished pulling the rug out from under them. I nodded slightly to Elias, who was standing by the audiovisual control board at the edge of the stage. Elias tapped a single command onto his encrypted tablet. The massive projection screen suspended above the dance floor, which had spent the entire evening looping romantic photographs of Monique's fake luxurious lifestyle, suddenly went pitch black. A second later, the screens illuminated with a blinding, harsh white light. Projected in massive, bold lettering across the entire ballroom was a certified copy of Spencer Sterling's Chapter 7. Bankruptcy Filing, heavily stamped with red confidential federal markers. Right beside it, covering the second screen, was an active, unsealed Federal Bureau of Investigation wire fraud indictment. It detailed a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme naming Spencer as the primary target, facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The collective gasp from the wedding guests sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. People began pulling out their phones, recording the screens, recording Spencer, recording the total annihilation of the Sterling Empire. Richard and Margaret Spencer's wealthy, aristocratic parents had been standing near the lobby doors, watching the scene unfold. When they saw the federal indictment projected onto the screens, the sheer aristocratic embarrassment was too much for them to bear. Margaret let out a loud, disgusted wail, covering her face with her designer clutch to hide from the smartphone cameras. Richard turned toward the sweetheart table, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are absolutely dead to us, Spencer," Richard bellowed across the silent room, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "Do not ever call us. Do not ask for bail money. You are no longer our son." Without another word, Spencer's parents turned and stormed out of the ballroom, pushing violently past the two federal agents who were still waiting patiently in the corridor shadows. They abandoned their son to the wolves, without a single second of hesitation. Spencer dropped his head onto the sweetheart table, sobbing uncontrollably into his folded arms, a pathetic, ruined man. Monique sat frozen beside him, staring blankly at the word bankruptcy glowing brightly above her head. Her fairy tale was completely dead and buried, but the reckoning was not over. I lowered the microphone slightly and shifted my gaze across the dance floor, pinning my mother and father under the harsh glare of the stage lights. Sylvia was still standing where I had left her, trembling so violently, her cheap floral dress shook around her knees. "And speaking of financial ruin," I said, bringing the microphone back to my lips, my voice dropping to a chilling, intimate register that carried to every single corner of the room. "Sylvia Calvin, let us talk about the $50,000 deposit you paid to secure this beautiful ballroom." Calvin let out a loud, agonizing groan from his chair, refusing to look up. Sylvia shook her head back and forth rapidly, her eyes begging me in silent terror to stop speaking. "You mortgaged your house for this fake party," I said, stripping away every last layer of their carefully maintained suburban dignity. "You took out a reverse mortgage and drained every single drop of equity from the home I grew up in entirely to impress a racist white family that just disowned their own son. You thought Spencer was going to pay the $250,000 final balance today. You thought he was your golden ticket to the Hamptons." I stepped right up to the very edge of the stage, looking down at my mother like a judge handing down an execution order. "But since Spencer is completely broke and currently on his way to a federal prison, the bank officially foreclosed on your property yesterday morning," I said, letting the devastating truth sink deep into their bones. "You have absolutely nothing left in your bank accounts. The locks on your front doors in Atlanta have already been changed. You are officially homeless." The absolute finality of my words acted like a physical blow to my mother's chest. Sylvia collapsed hard onto her knees, hitting the polished dance floor with a heavy thud. Her carefully styled hair fell into her face, and she let out a loud, guttural, animalistic wail of pure despair. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the hundreds of guests pointing their smartphone cameras directly at her misery. She reached the bottom of the stage and threw her arms out, trying desperately to grab the hem of my silk dress. "Justine, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking and breaking under the weight of her total destruction. "Please, you have to forgive us. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything I ever did to you. Please, just pay the bill, Justine. You have so much money you can buy the house back for us. We have nowhere to go. We are your parents. We are your flesh and blood. Justine, please do not leave us out on the street." She wept hysterically, her tears leaving dark, wet stains on the pristine ballroom carpet. Monique finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock at the sweetheart table. She stumbled down the raised platform, tripping over her $20,000 heavy tulle gown, and fell to her knees right next to our mother, weeping loudly and begging me to save them from the nightmare they had built for themselves. I stood on the edge of the stage, looking down at the two women who had tormented me, mocked me, and relentlessly abused me for my entire existence. I felt absolutely zero emotion. There was no pity in my chest. There was no lingering familial guilt. There was only the cold, hard, smooth surface of absolute justice. I looked down at my mother, observing her ruined makeup and her desperate, pleading hands. 12 years ago, I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear over the sound of their frantic sobbing. 12 years ago, you canceled my college graduation dinner because Monique needed you to dry her tears over a diamond ring. You abandoned me in a hot dorm room to cater to this exact same pathetic charade. You sent me a text message and told me that I was the strong one. You told me to figure it out all by myself. I crouched down slightly, bringing my face closer to hers, so she could see the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes. You were right, I whispered into the microphone. I was the strong one. And now it is your turn. Be strong, Sylvia. Figure it out. I stood back up and completely turned my back on her agonized screaming. I raised my hand and signaled sharply to the head of resort security, who had been waiting by the main double doors. The heavy mahogany doors swung wide open. The two federal agents marched directly into the ballroom, followed immediately by 4 uniformed local police officers. They moved with swift, terrifying efficiency, completely ignoring the panicked gasps of the wedding guests. They headed straight for the sweetheart table, where Spencer was still hyperventilating into his arms. Spencer Sterling. The lead federal agent announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and grand larceny. Stand up and put your hands behind your back. Spencer did not even try to resist. His spirit was entirely broken. He stood up on shaking legs and offered his wrist to the agents. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut with a loud metallic snap. The agents turned him around and marched the fake billionaire out of the ballroom, his head hanging low in ultimate public disgrace. Mr. Harrison! I called out over my shoulder, not even bothering to look back at the wreckage of my biological family on the dance floor. Have security escort the remainder of the Sterling and Anderson parties off my property immediately. They are permanently blacklisted from every Oasis Crown facility on the planet. Ensure they take their luggage and exit through the service doors. Yes, Madam CEO, Mr. Harrison replied, signaling the security guards to move in. The guards surrounded Monique, Sylvia, and Calvin. There was no more fighting left in them. They were entirely hollowed out, completely stripped of their fake wealth, their false dignity, and their toxic power. Calvin slowly lifted his sobbing wife off the floor, pulling her up by her arms, while Monique dragged her heavy, ruined designer gown behind her like a dirty blanket. They were forced to walk out of the grand ballroom, surrounded by imposing security guards, while hundreds of their invited guests watched in stunned, judgmental silence. I watched them trudge through the service corridors, dragging their generic suitcases through the humid, oppressive Florida night in their expensive, ruined evening wear. They had absolutely nowhere to go and absolutely no one to call. I turned away from the glass doors, leaving the wreckage entirely behind me. Elias was waiting for me at the edge of the stage, his eyes shining with profound pride and deep, unconditional love. He offered me his arm, and I took it, linking my arm firmly through his, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of his presence. We walked together through the parted crowd, moving out of the ballroom and into the grand lobby. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, triumphant glow over my skin. We reached the private VIP elevator, reserved strictly for the owner of the resort. The heavy metal doors slid open silently, and we stepped inside. I turned around to face the lobby, watching the distant, chaotic aftermath of my reckoning unfold one last time. The elevator doors began to close smoothly, shutting out the noise, shutting out the past, shutting out the toxic people who had spent their entire lives trying to break me. The doors sealed shut with a soft, final click. The elevator began its rapid, smooth ascent toward the penthouse suite. I leaned my head against Elias' shoulder, letting out a long, slow breath of pure relief. There was no toxic forgiveness. There was no forced reconciliation. I was completely, irrevocably free. The ghost of my past had finally been buried under the weight of their own greed, and my future belonged entirely to me. The most powerful lesson from Justine's journey is that biological ties do not excuse emotional or financial abuse. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and unconditional love, not manipulation or proximity to wealth. Justine teaches us that walking away from a toxic environment is not a sign of weakness, but a profound act of self-preservation and strength. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Ultimately, the best revenge isn't destruction, it's building a successful, authentic life on your own terms and refusing to let those who broke you sit at your table. Share your own story of setting healthy boundaries in the comments below, And don't forget to like and subscribe for more empowering journeys of self-discovery.